Eleanor ran her fingers along the smooth marble countertop of their kitchen island, counting her steps as she made her way toward the main hallway. 20 years of marriage had taught her to navigate their massive house without much trouble, but today felt different. Today the walls seemed to whisper with an energy she couldn't quite place. The house was buzzing with activity. Caterers rushed back and forth, their footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. She could hear crystal glasses clinking as they were arranged on tables, and the soft thud of expensive floral arrangements being positioned throughout the rooms. Their anniversary party was just 3 hours away, and Eleanor could feel the tension building like a storm in the air. Vincent had been unusually quiet all morning. She had heard him pacing in his office, talking in hushed tones on phone calls that seemed more urgent than his usual business discussions. When he did speak to her, his voice carried that edge she had grown to recognize over the years. It was the tone he used when he was planning something, and it never meant good things for her. She had learned to read the signs long ago. The way his breathing changed when he was frustrated with her, the particular silence that fell over a room when she entered and he was with his colleagues, the forced cheerfulness in his voice when he introduced her at social gatherings, always followed by some comment about her condition, as if it defined everything about who she was. Eleanor made her way to the living room, where she could hear workers arranging furniture. The party planner, a woman named Patricia who had organized their events for the past 5 years, was directing the setup with military precision. "Mrs. Chen, everything is looking absolutely beautiful," Patricia said warmly when she noticed Eleanor. "The flowers you chose are perfect. Those white orchids against the gold accents create such an elegant atmosphere." Eleanor smiled, though she felt a familiar pang. She hadn't actually chosen any flowers. Vincent had made all the decisions, as he always did. He preferred to handle what he called the visual elements of their entertaining, claiming it made more sense since she couldn't see the results anyway. But Patricia didn't need to know that. "Thank you, Patricia. I'm sure it's lovely," Eleanor replied, settling into her favorite armchair by the window. She could feel the warmth of the afternoon sun on her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. The truth was, Eleanor had mixed feelings about these parties. On one hand, she enjoyed the classical music that Vincent always hired musicians to play, and she appreciated the chance to engage in conversations with interesting people. But she also knew that these gatherings served another purpose for Vincent. They were opportunities for him to showcase his success, his beautiful home, his perfect life, and sometimes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was displayed as part of that success story, but not in the way most wives would be. Vincent's voice carried from the dining room, where he was reviewing the evening's timeline with the catering manager. She could hear fragments of their conversation about wine pairings and the sequence of courses. He was meticulous about details, especially when it came to impressing his business associates. Tonight's guest list included several potential investors for his latest tech venture, along with the usual crowd of wealthy friends and social contacts. Eleanor had met most of these people before, though she sometimes struggled to remember voices without faces to attach them to. Vincent often grew impatient when she took too long to recognize someone, and she had learned to develop strategies for navigating these social situations. She would position herself in familiar spots where people would come to her, rather than trying to circulate through crowds where she might accidentally interrupt conversations or bump into serving tables. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor retreated to their bedroom to prepare for the evening. She had chosen her dress carefully, a deep navy blue silk that Vincent had complimented when she wore it to a charity gala last month. She knew the importance of looking the part at these events, of reflecting well on Vincent's image. Her appearance mattered to him in ways that sometimes made her feel more like an accessory than a partner. While she was getting ready, Eleanor could hear Vincent in his dressing room, talking to himself as he often did when he was working through plans or problems. She caught fragments of words, something about showing them and making it clear. The tone in his voice made her stomach tighten with worry. Their relationship hadn't always been like this. When they first met 22 years ago, Vincent had seemed charmed by her independence, impressed by how she navigated the world with such confidence despite her blindness. He had been attracted to what he called her strength and grace, but somewhere along the way, those qualities that once drew him to her had become sources of frustration for him instead. Eleanor suspected that Vincent's growing success in business had changed his perspective on many things, including their marriage. As his company expanded and his social circle evolved to include more influential people, she began to sense that he saw her blindness differently. Instead of being something that made her unique and strong, it had become something that complicated his image of perfection. She finished applying her lipstick and smoothed down her dress, checking that her pearl necklace was centered properly. These small rituals of preparation had become important to her over the years. They gave her confidence and helped her feel ready to face whatever the evening might bring. Downstairs, she could hear the first guests beginning to arrive. Voices filled the foyer as people greeted each other with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for social gatherings, where business and pleasure mixed freely. Eleanor took a deep breath and made her way downstairs, using the banister she knew so well to guide her steps. Vincent appeared at her side almost immediately as she reached the main floor. His hand found her elbow in the way it always did at these events, a gesture that looked supportive to observers but felt controlling to her. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone he used in public settings. It was warmer than his usual speaking voice, but Eleanor had learned to detect the subtle falseness in it. "Are you ready to meet our guests?" As he guided her toward the main gathering area, Eleanor could feel dozens of conversations pausing as people noticed their entrance. She had grown accustomed to this moment of attention, the brief silence that often occurred when she appeared at social gatherings. But tonight, something in Vincent's grip on her arm felt different, tighter, more purposeful. The evening was about to begin, and Eleanor had no idea that Vincent had been planning something special for their anniversary celebration. Something that would put her directly in the spotlight in a way she had never experienced before. The party was in full swing when Eleanor noticed Vincent's mood had shifted completely. For the past hour, he had been the perfect host, moving through their guests with practiced charm, discussing business deals and sharing stories about their latest vacation to Europe. But now, as she stood near the French doors leading to their garden, she could sense him watching her from across the room. She had been having a pleasant conversation with Dr. Williams, an elderly gentleman who taught literature at the local university. He was telling her about a new book of poetry he had discovered when she felt Vincent approaching. His footsteps had a particular rhythm when he was excited about something, and tonight that rhythm made her stomach clench with worry. "Excuse me, Dr. Williams," Vincent said, his voice carrying an unusual brightness that immediately put Eleanor on edge. "I hate to interrupt, but I need to borrow my wife for a moment." Eleanor felt Vincent's hand close around her arm, and this time there was no mistaking the firmness of his grip. He was steering her away from the conversation, away from the comfortable corner where she had positioned herself for the evening. As they moved through the crowd, Eleanor could hear conversations pause and resume in their wake. "Vincent, where are we going?" she asked quietly, trying to keep her voice light despite the growing unease in her chest. "You'll see," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made her want to pull away from him. But they were surrounded by guests, and making a scene would only make things worse. As they walked, Eleanor tried to orient herself within their large living space. She could tell they were moving toward the far end of the room, near the area where Vincent displayed his collection of art and antiques. The sounds around them were changing too. Fewer conversations, more footsteps, and then she realized what was happening. People were following them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent called out suddenly, his voice carrying easily across the room. Eleanor felt her heart start to race as she realized he was addressing their guests. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment." The room began to quiet, conversations trailing off as people turned to see what Vincent wanted to announce. Eleanor could feel dozens of eyes on them and her mouth went dry. Vincent never made impromptu speeches at their parties. He was too calculated, too careful about controlling every aspect of these events. 21 years ago, Vincent continued, his voice warm and nostalgic in a way that might have fooled anyone who didn't know him as well as Eleanor did. "I met the most remarkable woman. She was brilliant, independent, and talented in ways that amazed me every single day." Eleanor forced a smile, though inside she was screaming for him to stop. She knew this tone. She knew what came after the compliments. "Eleanor has always been modest about her abilities," Vincent went on, and now Eleanor could feel the trap closing around her. "She spent years downplaying her talents, but tonight on our anniversary, I thought it would be wonderful if she shared one of her gifts with all of you." The room fell completely silent now. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of expectation from every person in the room. And then Vincent was guiding her forward again, and she realized where they were going. The piano. Their baby grand piano sat in the corner of the living room like a beautiful piece of furniture, which is exactly what it had been for most of their marriage. Eleanor had played when she was younger before she met Vincent, but those days felt like a lifetime ago. She had mentioned it once early in their relationship, and Vincent had insisted on buying the expensive instrument for their first home together. But as the years passed, the piano had become more of a decoration than anything else. Vincent? No, Eleanor whispered, but his grip on her arm tightened. Don't be shy, darling, he said, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear. Everyone would love to hear you play. Eleanor's mind was racing. She hadn't played seriously in years. She had no idea what condition the piano was in, whether it was even properly tuned, and she could feel the anticipation in the room shifting into something else. Some of the guests were probably confused, others might be concerned, but she suspected that a few were already pulling out their phones. Vincent positioned her in front of the piano bench, and Eleanor could feel the smooth wood under her fingertips as she reached out to steady herself. The familiar smell of the piano's wood polish filled her senses, bringing back memories she had tried to keep buried. She's been practicing, Vincent announced to the room, and Eleanor's blood ran cold. That was a lie. She hadn't practiced anything. She hadn't even touched these keys in months, maybe longer. Vincent, please, she said quietly, hoping only he could hear her, but he was already addressing their guests again. Eleanor learned to play when she was young, and she's incredibly talented. I've been encouraging her to perform for friends, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity. Eleanor could hear murmurs rippling through the crowd. Some people sounded excited, others uncertain. She recognized a few voices of people she knew well, friends who would be genuinely interested in hearing her play. But she also heard whispers that sounded less kind, and she realized that some of their guests might be expecting exactly what Vincent was hoping for: a disaster. The piano bench was directly behind her now, and Vincent's hand on her shoulder was guiding her to sit down. Eleanor's legs felt weak as she lowered herself onto the familiar seat. Her hands were trembling as she lifted them toward the keyboard. She could feel Vincent standing beside the piano, probably wearing that smile he used when he was particularly pleased with himself. She could sense the crowd gathered around them, phones probably ready to capture whatever was about to happen, and she could feel the weight of 21 years of marriage. Of all the small moments when Vincent had made her feel less than capable, all building up to this single moment, Eleanor's fingers hovered over the keys, and she realized she had a choice to make. She could fumble through something simple and give Vincent exactly what he wanted: proof that she was an embarrassment, confirmation that her blindness made her inadequate for his successful life. Or she could do something else entirely. The room held its breath as Eleanor finally let her fingers touch the piano keys. What happened next would change everything. Eleanor's fingers pressed down on the first keys, and the sound that filled the room was nothing like what anyone expected. Instead of the hesitant, amateur notes Vincent had been hoping for, rich, clear tones flowed from the piano like water from a mountain spring. She began with something soft and haunting, a melody that seemed to wrap around every person in the room and draw them closer. Her fingers moved with a confidence that surprised even her, finding each key with the kind of precision that only came from hours of practice. Because that's exactly what it was. For the past 2 years, Eleanor had been living a secret life. Every morning after Vincent left for work, Eleanor had walked 6 blocks to Mrs. Chen's music academy. Mrs. Chen was a 70-year-old woman who had once performed in concert halls around the world before retiring to teach. When Eleanor first knocked on her door, nervous and uncertain, Mrs. Chen had listened to her story with understanding eyes. Music doesn't need sight, Mrs. Chen had said that first day. Music needs feeling. And you, my dear, have more feeling in your pinky finger than most people have in their entire bodies. 3 mornings a week, Eleanor had rebuilt her relationship with the piano. She started with simple exercises, working through scales and basic pieces to rebuild the muscle memory she had lost during her years away from music. But Mrs. Chen quickly realized that Eleanor had a natural gift that had been sleeping, not lost. Now, as her fingers danced across the keys in her own living room, Eleanor felt all those months of secret practice flowing through her hands. The melody she was playing wasn't from any book or lesson plan. It was something she had composed herself, something that came from the deepest parts of her heart. Vincent's confident expression was beginning to change. Eleanor couldn't see his face, but she could feel the shift in his energy as he realized this wasn't going according to his plan. The room had gone completely silent except for the music, and she could sense people moving closer, drawn in by sounds they hadn't expected to hear. The piece she was playing told a story. It spoke of loneliness and frustration, of feeling trapped in a beautiful cage. But it also spoke of hope, of dreams that refused to die even when they were buried under years of discouragement. Every note carried the weight of all the times Vincent had made her feel small, all the times he had introduced her as my blind wife instead of just my wife. Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door and had come to several of their parties over the years, was the first to gasp audibly. Eleanor heard her whisper to someone nearby, "Oh my goodness, she's incredible." As Eleanor moved into the more complex section of her composition, her left hand began playing a deep, steady rhythm, while her right hand wove intricate melodies above it. This was the kind of playing that required years of training, the kind of skill that couldn't be faked or stumbled through. Her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting their craft. Vincent had taken a step back from the piano, and Eleanor could practically feel his confusion. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. This wasn't the woman he had been married to for 21 years. Or rather, it was that woman, but it was also someone entirely new. The secret lessons with Mrs. Chen had been about more than just learning to play piano again. They had been about remembering who Eleanor was before she became Vincent's wife. Mrs. Chen had encouraged her to compose her own music, to put her feelings into melodies that no one else could create. And Eleanor had discovered that she had a lot to say. Dr. Williams, who had been talking with Eleanor earlier, moved closer to the piano. Eleanor could hear him breathing, could sense his amazement. Behind him, other guests were gathering, and the quality of silence in the room had changed completely. This wasn't the polite attention people gave to amateur performances. This was the kind of focused listening that happened when people encountered something truly special. Eleanor's composition began to build toward its climax, and she let herself pour everything into the music. All the years of feeling invisible, all the times Vincent had dismissed her opinions or made decisions without consulting her, all the loneliness of being married to someone who saw her as a burden rather than a partner. But the music also carried her strength, her resilience, and her determination to be more than what others expected of her. As the melody soared, Eleanor became aware that something else was happening in the room. She could hear people whispering, but these weren't the whispers of people watching a disaster unfold. These were sounds of recognition, of surprise, of genuine appreciation. A woman's voice near the back of the room said quietly, "Wait, isn't she? Didn't she used to perform professionally?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone to remember her from her performing days. That had been so long ago, before her marriage, when she was still Eleanor Martinez instead of Eleanor Chen. She had performed at small venues around the city, had even been featured in the local arts magazine once. But that felt like another lifetime. Vincent's voice cut through the growing murmurs. "Darling, that's enough," he said, and Eleanor could hear the strain in his voice. He was trying to sound casual, but she knew him well enough to detect the panic underneath. But Eleanor wasn't ready to stop. She had waited years for a moment like this, a chance to show people who she really was. Her fingers continued to move across the keys, and the music continued to fill the room with its power and beauty. More people were whispering now, and Eleanor caught fragments of conversations. Someone was mentioning a concert they had attended years ago. Another person was talking about a young pianist who had disappeared from the local music scene, and slowly, Eleanor realized that some of their guests were beginning to piece together who she had been before she became Mrs. Chen. The music was building to its final crescendo now, and Eleanor let herself get lost in the moment. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. She felt like herself again. And she could sense that everyone in the room, including Vincent, was seeing her in a completely new light. As she prepared to bring the piece to its dramatic conclusion, Eleanor realized that this moment was changing everything. There would be no going back to the way things were before. The woman who had been hiding behind years of quiet disappointment was finally stepping into the light, and she was ready for whatever came next. Eleanor's fingers found the final notes of her composition, and the last chord hung in the air like a prayer. For several seconds, the entire room remained completely silent. She could hear nothing except the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of her own heartbeat. Then, like a dam breaking, the silence shattered. The applause started slowly with one person, then two. Then suddenly the entire room was clapping with an intensity that Eleanor had never experienced at any of Vincent's parties. But it wasn't just polite social applause. People were clapping with genuine emotion, with surprise, with something that sounded almost like reverence. Eleanor remained seated at the piano bench, her hand still resting on the keys, trying to process what was happening around her. She could hear voices mixed in with the applause, people calling out compliments and expressions of amazement. "That was extraordinary," Dr. Williams said loudly enough for others to hear. "Absolutely extraordinary." Vincent's voice cut through the noise, and Eleanor could hear the strain he was trying to hide. "Well, that was certainly unexpected," he said, attempting his usual smooth tone but failing to mask his confusion and growing irritation. But the guests weren't paying attention to Vincent anymore. Eleanor could sense people moving closer to the piano, could hear the rustle of clothing and the shuffle of feet as the crowd pressed in around her. Someone touched her shoulder gently. "My dear, that was beautiful," said Mrs. Patterson from next door. "I had no idea you were so talented. That piece, did you write it yourself?" Eleanor nodded, still feeling overwhelmed by the response. "Yes, I composed it recently." "What do you call it?" asked another voice, one Eleanor didn't immediately recognize. "Unseen Strength," Eleanor replied quietly, and she heard several people repeat the title to each other in hushed, appreciative tones. That's when Eleanor heard a voice that made her blood run cold with recognition. It belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez, an older woman who had been friends with Vincent's family for decades. She was standing somewhere near the back of the crowd, but her voice carried clearly across the room. "Wait a minute," Mrs. Rodriguez said slowly, and Eleanor could hear the wheels turning in her mind. "Eleanor Martinez. I knew that name sounded familiar. You're the young woman who used to perform at the Riverside Theater, aren't you?" The room fell quiet again, but this was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of people suddenly putting pieces together, of recognition dawning. Eleanor felt her heart racing. She had hoped that enough years had passed, that people would have forgotten about her brief career as a performer. But Mrs. Rodriguez had an excellent memory, and she wasn't finished talking. "Yes, I remember now," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her voice growing more excited. "You were featured in the arts section of the newspaper several times. There was that article about young local musicians to watch. You were supposed to be the next big thing, and then you just disappeared." Eleanor could feel Vincent's energy changing beside her. She sensed him moving closer, probably trying to figure out how to control this situation, how to redirect the conversation back to something safer, but it was too late for that. "I remember that article," said another guest, a man's voice that Eleanor thought might belong to Mr. Thompson, who owned several restaurants in the city. "They called you a prodigy, said you had more natural talent than anyone they'd seen in years." "What happened?" asked Dr. Williams gently. "Why did you stop performing?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but Vincent spoke first. "Eleanor decided to focus on her family life," he said quickly. "She chose marriage over career, which was perfectly natural." But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't satisfied with that explanation. "I remember now," she said, and Eleanor could hear the pieces clicking into place in her mind. "The last article about you was an engagement announcement. You were marrying—" She paused, and Eleanor knew she was looking at Vincent. "You were marrying Vincent Chen." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Eleanor could practically hear people doing the math, figuring out the timeline, understanding that her disappearance from the music scene had coincided exactly with her marriage to the man standing beside her. "So you've been hiding this incredible talent all these years?" asked a woman's voice that Eleanor thought might belong to Dr. Kim, who worked at the local hospital. "Why would you keep something so beautiful to yourself?" Eleanor felt tears starting to form in her eyes. These were questions she had asked herself countless times over the years. Questions about choices she had made, about dreams she had given up, about the person she used to be before she became Vincent's wife. Eleanor started to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Vincent's hand landed on her shoulder and his grip was firm. "I think that's enough excitement for one evening," he said, his voice carrying that warning tone Eleanor knew so well. "Eleanor gets tired easily, and I'm sure our guests would like to return to the party." But the guests weren't ready to let this moment go. Someone started clapping again, and soon the entire room was applauding Eleanor once more. Several people were calling out requests for her to play another piece. "Please, play something else," called out Mrs. Patterson. "That was the most beautiful music I've heard in years." "Yes, please," echoed Dr. Williams. "Do you know any classical pieces?" Eleanor looked up toward where she thought Vincent was standing, though she couldn't see his expression. She could feel his displeasure radiating from him like heat from a fire. This was the opposite of what he had planned. Instead of embarrassing her, he had given her a platform to shine brighter than he had ever imagined possible. "I don't think," Vincent started to say, but his words were drowned out by the continued requests from their guests. Eleanor realized she was at a crossroads. She could stand up now, thank everyone politely, and return to being the quiet, diminished version of herself that Vincent preferred. Or she could seize this moment, this opportunity that had fallen into her lap because of his own cruel plan. She thought about Mrs. Chen, her piano teacher, who had spent months encouraging her to believe in herself again. She thought about all the compositions she had written in secret, all the music that lived inside her that no one had ever heard. And she thought about the woman she used to be, the Eleanor Martinez who had dreams and ambitions and the courage to pursue them. Eleanor's hands moved back to the piano keys. "Actually," she said, her voice stronger now, "I would love to play something else." Eleanor's hands settled on the piano keys once again, and this time she felt completely different. The nervousness was gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt in over 20 years. Pure confidence. She was no longer the woman Vincent had tried to diminish. She was Eleanor Martinez again, the musician who had once made audiences hold their breath with anticipation. "This next piece," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "is something I wrote about finding your voice again after years of silence." Vincent moved closer to the piano, and Eleanor could sense his desperation. "Eleanor, really, I think our guests would prefer to return to the party," he said, trying to sound casual but failing completely. But nobody was listening to Vincent anymore. The room was focused entirely on Eleanor, waiting to see what magic she would create next. She could feel their anticipation like electricity in the air. Eleanor began to play, and this piece was different from the first. Where unseen strength had been contemplative and building, this new composition was bold and soaring from the very first notes. Her fingers moved across the keys with the kind of passion that made people forget where they were, forget everything except the music washing over them. And then Eleanor did something that shocked everyone in the room, including herself. She began to sing. Her voice rose above the piano melody, clear and strong and filled with emotions that had been locked away for decades. The words she sang spoke of dreams deferred but not destroyed, of love that became control, of finding the courage to break free from cages that looked like safety. The room was completely silent except for Eleanor's voice and the piano. People had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped everything except listening. Even Vincent stood frozen, staring at his wife as if he had never seen her before. Because in many ways, he hadn't. Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each verse, and the melody built to heights that made several people in the room wipe tears from their eyes. Mrs. Patterson was openly crying. Dr. Williams had his hand pressed to his heart. And in the back of the room, Eleanor could hear someone recording the performance on their phone. When the song reached its climax, Eleanor's voice soared over the piano in a way that made the entire room feel like a concert hall. This wasn't just someone playing piano at a house party. This was artistry of the highest level, the kind of performance that belonged on professional stages. As the final notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. Then the applause began, and it was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering. Someone whistled. Others called out, "Bravo." The sound was overwhelming and beautiful, and everything Eleanor had dreamed of during those lonely years when she thought her music was lost forever. "Incredible," Dr. Williams said loudly. "Absolutely incredible. Eleanor, that was professional quality. Better than professional quality." Mrs. Rodriguez pushed forward through the crowd, her excitement obvious in her voice. My dear, you have to start performing again. The city needs to hear this music. The world needs to hear this music. Vincent finally found his voice. Now let's not get carried away, he said. But his words sounded weak against the enthusiasm of the crowd. That's when someone Eleanor didn't recognize spoke up. It was a woman's voice, confident and businesslike. Actually, let's talk about exactly that. Eleanor, my name is Lisa Chen and I'm a talent scout for Riverside Records. I came tonight as Dr. Williams' guest and I have to say what I just heard was extraordinary. Eleanor felt her heart stop. Riverside Records was one of the most respected independent labels in the country, known for discovering and promoting serious musicians. Lisa continued, I'd like to talk with you about the possibility of recording some of your compositions. What you've shown us tonight is the kind of authentic artistry that's becoming rare in the music industry. The room erupted in excited chatter. People were congratulating Eleanor, asking her questions, telling her how moved they were by her performance. Several guests mentioned they had recorded parts of her songs and were already sharing them with friends. Vincent looked like he had been hit by a truck. His face was pale, and Eleanor could practically feel his shock radiating across the room. His plan to embarrass her had become the launching pad for her return to the music world. Eleanor started to speak, but found herself overwhelmed by the moment. Dr. Williams stepped closer to the piano. Eleanor, I have a confession to make. I've been trying to remember where I knew your name from all evening. Now I remember. My late wife was a music teacher and she used to talk about you. She attended one of your concerts at the Riverside Theater about 22 years ago, and she came home raving about this young woman who was going to change the local music scene. She never forgot that performance. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. Someone had remembered. Someone had carried the memory of her music for all these years. More people began sharing their memories. Mr. Thompson remembered reading about her in the newspaper. Mrs. Patterson's daughter had been a music student and had looked up to Eleanor as an inspiration. Piece by piece, Eleanor realized that her brief career had touched more lives than she had ever known. Lisa from Riverside Records was still talking, explaining how she wanted to set up a meeting, how she could see Eleanor performing at intimate venues around the country, how her compositions could find the audience they deserved. Vincent made one last attempt to regain control. Eleanor, you need to think about this carefully. Your health, your limitations, the practical considerations, but Eleanor cut him off. My only limitation, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the room, has been believing that I wasn't enough. But tonight I remembered who I really am. The crowd applauded again, and Eleanor realized that Vincent's cruel plan had given her the greatest gift possible. He had forced her out of hiding and back into the light where she belonged. As the evening continued, Eleanor found herself surrounded by people eager to support her return to music. Dr. Williams offered to help her connect with other musicians. Mrs. Patterson promised to spread the word about her performances. 3 different people asked if she gave piano lessons. Vincent stood alone near the window, watching his wife become the center of attention in a way he had never intended. For 21 years, he had worked to make Eleanor smaller, quieter, less than what she could be. Tonight, his own cruelty had freed her from the cage he had built around her dreams. Eleanor's fingers touched the piano keys one more time, playing a soft, gentle melody as people continued to talk and plan and dream around her. She was no longer Vincent's diminished wife. She was Eleanor Martinez, the musician, and she was finally ready to let the world hear her voice again. The woman Vincent had tried to shame had just reclaimed her life, one beautiful note at a time.